Picture this. You're at church, sitting in the pews, Bible in hand, and the pastor is mid-sermon when the unthinkable happens. Masked men storm into the sanctuary, guns drawn, and in a matter of seconds, the pastor is gone. It reportedly happened at a church where Tennessee pastor Josh Sullivan was on a missionary trip. In the middle of his message, witnesses say armed men burst through the doors, walked straight up to the pulpit, and kidnapped him in front of his entire congregation. His loved ones were praying for a miracle, and their wish just came true. The pastor has been rescued, miraculously unharmed, after he was reportedly kidnapped. I'm Kennedi Walker, and I'll walk you through the details that arguably shakes the very foundation of faith, fear, and what it means to be called to serve. A Tennessee pastor became the center of a criminal investigation. Police say he was kidnapped at gunpoint during worship in front of his wife, his children, and his congregation. His name is Josh Sullivan. He's a husband, father, and missionary. He's someone who, by all accounts, moved to South Africa to help. And now he's a man at the heart of what some called a targeted abduction. It happened around 7 p.m. on Thursday, April 10th. Sullivan was leading a prayer meeting in Motherwell, South Africa. For perspective, this is on the southern tip of South Africa between St. Francis Bay and Kenton-on-Sea. Sullivan was not alone. About 30 people were there, including his wife and children. Then the unthinkable happened. According to CBS News, armed men burst into the church. They allegedly stole 2 cell phones from members of the congregation, and then they took Sullivan, reportedly forcing him into his own truck, a silver Toyota 4Runner, and driving off. That 4Runner was later found abandoned in Motherwell, but Sullivan was not in it. According to his home church in Tennessee, Fellowship Baptist, Sullivan and his wife Megan had moved to South Africa in 2018 to help run a local branch. They were deep into their work, building community and raising their family. So why was he kidnapped? Well, per CBS, Reverend Jeremy Hall, another pastor working in the region, believes the motive was financial. He reportedly said the abductors knew the pastor by name. Well, nearly a week after he was taken, the pastor was rescued amid a shootout between the South African police and his kidnappers. Police say 3 of the suspects were killed. Protocol dictated once the ransom was demanded, the case is turned over to South Africa's Hawks, a special investigative unit that deals with organized crime and corruption. Sullivan was rescued from a safe house reportedly being used by his captors. Police said in a statement, quote, "The suspects inside the vehicle, upon seeing law enforcement, allegedly attempted to flee and open fire on the team. The officers responded with tactical precision, leading to a high-intensity shootout in which 3 unidentified suspects were fatally wounded." Sullivan was reportedly found, quote, "miraculously unharmed in the vehicle. He was immediately assessed by medical personnel and is currently in excellent condition." Fortunately, Josh Sullivan is one of the lucky ones. In South Africa, the crime numbers paint a grim picture. According to the Institute for Security Studies, kidnappings in South Africa have spiked up 264% in the last decade. In just 1 year, 2023 to 2024, over 17,000 kidnappings were reported, and the violence does not stop there. Each day, 33 people are killed by guns in South Africa, according to Gun Free South Africa, a nonprofit tracking the nation's rising gun violence. Sullivan's family, church, and a growing number of supporters around the world were asking for prayers for his safe return. Now, their prayers have been answered. And joining me to talk more about this is international lawyer and former State Department official David Tafuri. David, thank you so much for coming on. Let's jump right in. Now that Josh Sullivan has been found, what legal steps, if any, come next for him?
Well, first of all, he needs to he's going probably in the hospital. He's being checked out by doctors. He'll need to be debriefed by the police and the authorities in South Africa. Notably, 3 people were killed in the shootout during his rescue. And so one really important question is, were there any other people responsible for this crime, this kidnapping, who escaped or who are, out there somewhere, and that the police need to go and try to capture and arrest and put on trial for these crimes? Or were only these 3 people the people responsible for the crimes. My guess is there were others involved in this. So that's one of the most important points that needs to be reviewed and considered. With respect to the pastor, my hope is that because reportedly he was not injured, he will be able to go back to his job. Obviously, there's going to need to be more security at the church where he teaches and maybe at his home. They need to take additional precautions to make sure this does not happen again.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I would honestly be surprised if he even wants to stay in South Africa after this. He may want to come back to the United States. But you brought up a good point. Three of the kidnappers were killed, but as far as the others, we're assuming because there were some news outlets reported four kidnappers, other news outlets reported six kidnappers. We're assuming that there are still others alive. Can U.S. law enforcement still pursue charges against them, even though the crime happened abroad?
Well, first of all, I'm tracking with what you said that some reports suggested there were six people responsible for the kidnapping. Some said four. Either way, it sounds like there are some people who have not been apprehended, could be apprehended, could be charged with crimes, could be put on trial for those crimes. My guess is that that trial would occur in South Africa, especially because the authorities seem to be on the ball about this crime and they're taking the lead in the investigation. They would have jurisdiction, of course, because the crimes occurred in South Africa and also because the people who perpetrated them are apparently South African nationals. So the U.S. doesn't have a strong tie to the crimes other than that the victim is American. And so I don't expect the United States would be seeking to take jurisdiction over this case or extradite these people, especially because the U.S. would likely trust that the South African authorities can handle a trial for these crimes.
Yeah, you just answered my next question. I was going to ask if there's any way the kidnappers could be extradited to the U.S. Is that something that usually happens, or it's just the country would handle it themselves? South Africa would
It
handle it
would
most likely.
it would be unusual in this case for there to be an extradition because the crimes occurred in South Africa. The persons who committed the crimes are South African nationals. South Africa has a sufficient court system to handle these types of cases. Only if the United States for some reason thought that South Africa couldn't handle them and there was a deal between the South Africa and the United States would there be an extradition. But again, I don't. This is not the type of case where an extradition would occur, even if the U.S. could have jurisdiction, which is questionable.
Does the pastor have any protections or privacy rights now that he's been safely returned?
Sure, I mean he has basic privacy rights, but this has been widely publicized across the world. It's been in international media, so he's already the subject of a lot of discussion. People are aware that this crime happened. He will have to choose the path he wants to take. Is he going to do, for instance, any kind of discussions with the press? Is he going to put out a statement? We don't know. But I think around the world, especially here in the United States, where he was from, people are very happy and gratified to see that he has made it through this because a lot of people do not survive a kidnapping like this.
What role does the U.S. embassy or consulate typically play once a kidnapped citizen is found?
Well, certainly the embassy has a responsibility to look after U.S. citizens in a foreign country and to ensure they're being treated properly by the government and the legal system of the country that they are in. Again, it doesn't seem like there's any question there that the South African authorities have not considered this, very important. I did read that Senator Blackburn, who's senator from Tennessee, where the pastor was from, had contacted the U.S. Embassy, and that would just put additional pressure on the U.S. Embassy to be, very aware of what's happening with the pastor, and likely before he was rescued, the U.S. Embassy probably engaged with the South African authorities to make sure they were giving this sufficient attention and resources, and maybe that did happen, and maybe that's also helped to ensure that the South African authorities pursued the leads that they had in order to ultimately rescue him.
Yeah, and we have to say, you mentioned earlier that this pastor was one of the lucky ones, and he definitely was. The South Africa police, they did everything that they possibly could to get him home. Is it? Do you think there was some pressure from the United States? Is what kind of cooperation exists between the U.S. and South Africa when it comes to crimes like this?
Well, the U.S. and South Africa obviously are allies. There's a long relationship between our countries, though it's not with areas of disagreement. But I think on something like this, there was likely good cooperation. The embassy, we have a very large embassy in South Africa, and it likely has lawyers and maybe even FBI agents. Oftentimes, there is a legal attaché who is an FBI agent in a U.S. embassy. The larger ones have that. So that person could have been liaisoning with the FBI back in the United States and would have also some responsibility just to make sure that the South African authorities were doing their job. And if this was the type of crime where it had not been solved for a long time and the U.S. had sufficient interest, and I think the U.S. would, that the FBI agents in the embassy might take a more active role in ensuring that every lead is tracked down and there's effort is being made to find the person who has been kidnapped.
Could this case set any legal precedent for how future kidnappings involving missionaries are handled?
Uh, I'm not sure because we don't have all the details yet, but certainly something really positive happened here that they were able very quickly to figure out who had taken the pastor, to track him down and to rescue him. And that may be because there was, some pressure put on the South African authorities. It may be because also the South African authorities put sufficient resources to go after this person. You would hope they do that for every kidnapping, but maybe they don't. And so there could be some lessons to learn. And it would be very interesting to know how they figured out where the kidnappers were and how they ultimately found the pastor.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested, and I can't wait for more details to come out. But I know you mentioned earlier that in this case, most likely the suspects that are still alive, they would not get extradited back to the U.S. How are crimes committed against U.S. citizens abroad typically prosecuted? Is this always how it goes? Is it by the host country, the U.S., or both?
Well, it depends. It really depends on the situation. Extradition is normally done when a crime occurs in one country and the person flees from that country to a second country. And so the country that wants to put the person on trial has issued an arrest warrant for that person, will then try to track down that person. If they locate that person in a second country, then they'll make an extradition request. Sometimes both countries have jurisdiction over the person, and there are times when, especially if the person is a criminal who's committed many crimes, there might be crimes in one country that they committed. That country that has the person wants to put him on trial first, and then may consider him extraditing to another country that also has jurisdiction for separate crimes or for related crimes. And so this just doesn't seem to be the type of case where extradition would be necessary because the crimes occurred there and the perpetrators of the crimes are South African. And again, because South Africa does have a respected legal system, not without its flaws, as any legal system has, but it's a respected legal system where I think the United States and U.S. authorities would view it as being sufficiently capable of giving due process to the people charged and putting them through a fair trial that should result in in justice. And because the U.S. would likely have that confidence, unless there was some egregious error in the system, I don't think the U.S. would be seeking to extradite.
Now, in this instance, Josh Sullivan, thankfully, there was a happy ending, right? He was able to go home to his
Right.
family. But historically, how have cases involving kidnapped Americans abroad shaped international policy?
Well, sometimes if the person is kidnapped and taken to another country, right, then that would be a situation where there are more international issues involved. Or if, for instance, the crime is committed with resources from another country, with support from another country, or if there's international trafficking in persons happening, then there would be more international issues involved. If the person commits the crime in one country and then flees to another, you can go and apply to Interpol to have a red flag put on that person. If Interpol agrees, then what's helpful to the country that's seeking to apprehend that person is that when that person travels to any airport in any country that is a member of Interpol, that person could be arrested and then subject to extradition back to the first country that made the application to Interpol.
Could the church be vulnerable to lawsuits from Sullivan's family if they feel the trip was poorly managed or they didn't take the right precautions, if they knew that potentially this was an unsafe country that they were sending a missionary to?
It depends on whether the church engaged in any negligence. And in this case, again, we don't have all the facts, but it sounds like this pastor has been in South Africa for many years. I think he first got there in 2018, and it sounds like this pastor really wanted to be there. He continued to extend his stay. He was learning the local language, Xhosa, which the people that were part of his congregation were from the ethnic group that speaks Xhosa. And so in this case, it sounds like he had made a number of different choices to stay there, and likely he understood the risks involved in staying there. And unless there's other facts that suggest negligence by the church, that they were warned that they needed security and they refused to have security, that would be a potential fact that suggests negligence. But unless there's other facts like that suggest negligence, I wouldn't think this would be a case where there would be a successful lawsuit against the church.
Well, to avoid potential, lawsuits in the future, would it make sense for missionary organizations to, to be legally required to conduct risk assessments or even, install some type of safety training?
Well, for sure, any church or company organization sending people overseas, especially to countries with high crime rates, which South Africa does have now, should be performing those types of risk assessments. And if they're not, first of all, advising the persons that are responsible, that are going on these trips, of the risks, then they would be, potentially more vulnerable to being held liable for negligence. I would also mention some of this information is easily available, because if you go to the U.S. State Department website and you go to the embassy website for the country where you're thinking about traveling, there are travel warnings for countries, and there's pretty good reporting by the State Department on the crime rate, the risk of terrorism, and the other risks to travelers going to that country.
Now, we're still waiting on some more of the details to come out, but articles are saying that the way the pastor was rescued, the South Africa police, they were able to, come rescue him. They got into kind of like a shoot off with some of the suspects. 3 of them died. Don't know about the others, but we know that this all started, the reports say, because of a ransom. We don't know if that was ever paid or if the police, was able to, get the pastor back before having it be paid. But if someone did pay the ransom privately, could they face any legal consequences under U.S. law?
I don't think so. The U.S. discourages the payment of ransom, or the payment, for instance, to terrorist groups who take people hostage. But the U.S. does not, as a matter of policy, prosecute a family, for instance, for paying a ransom, in recognition of the fact that some families have to make, very difficult decisions about whether to pay a ransom or not, and they are putting their family member first. And so I'm not aware of the U.S. ever prosecuting anyone for that, and especially when it's a common crime, common criminals, as this case appears to be, versus a terrorist organization, or like a terrorist organization that's on a sanctions list. It's even less likely that that payment of a ransom would run afoul of any U.S. law.
Is there any legal, medical, or psychological support that a returning hostage like Josh Sullivan is entitled to?
I mean, the U.S. government might offer some of that, but there's no law that requires the U.S. government to provide that, and the U.S. government may not have the resources in country in South Africa to provide that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, such a tough time for the Sullivan family. They say that Josh Sullivan, thankfully he is not hurt, but I'm sure that there's going to be lots of therapy that he's probably going to need after an incident like this one. Any last advice that you would offer people? Like, what should families and churches do differently next time to legally prepare for overseas missions?
Well, as someone who spent a lot of time in Africa, including in South Africa, you need to first do a lot of research on the country you're in, and not just the country, but the specific area you are going to be in. And you need to understand the risks, the crime rate, the potential for conflict to occur, the potential for there to be acts of terrorism, and you also need to take steps to protect yourself. And that includes, having a security system, surveillance system, check-ins with the authorities, and those are all very important things as someone who travels through, developing countries and conflict and post-conflict countries. These are the things that I do to help reduce the risk. But you can never eliminate the risk, especially in a country like South Africa, which has a rising crime rate. It has a very large population that is poor, and some of them have resorted to crime, and increasingly, unfortunately.
Right. Well, this is a story that we will definitely be following. Thank you so much, David, for coming on with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Friends of the Sullivan family have asked the community to continue to pray for them. For Law and Crime News, I'm Kennedi Walker.